Rubella or German measles was historically considered to be a disease of such little consequence that children would gladly accept the diagnosis in order to get some sympathy or even a few days off school. Indeed, Sir Macfarlane Burnet said that until 1940, German measles was universally considered to be the mildest of all infectious diseases. However, the narrative abruptly changed in 1941 when an Australian ophthalmologist published a single paper that supposedly proved the rubella virus could seriously injure or even kill developing babies. It caused widespread panic and was one of the factors that led to the introduction of the rubella vaccine in the late 1960s. By 1971, this vaccine was incorporated into the infamous MMR, or measles, mumps and rubella vaccine. In this video, I'll uncover the virological fraud that resulted in a phantom menace that haunts our community to this very day. Wikipedia's Rubella entry states that rubella, also known as German measles or 3-day measles, is a vaccine-preventable infection caused by the rubella virus. This disease is often mild, with half of people not realizing that they are infected. At this point it sounds like a nothing burger, but then a few sentences later we read that infection during early pregnancy may result in a miscarriage or a child born with congenital rubella syndrome, CRS. Symptoms of CRS manifest as problems with the eyes such as cataracts, deafness, as well as affecting the heart and brain. Those of us who went to medical school were shocked by this story. On one hand, it was a trivial childhood illness that anyone could be expected to experience, but for pregnant mums, it was a nightmare scenario. Indeed, when we head over to the CDC's Pregnancy and Rubella page, we read that rubella is very dangerous for developing babies and can cause congenital rubella syndrome. Anyone who is not vaccinated against rubella is at risk of getting the disease. You should make sure you are vaccinated against rubella before you get pregnant. As well as grabbing the attention of medical practitioners, this is also the narrative that has convinced hundreds of millions of people to accept the rubella vaccine. Since 1971, this has often been administered as a combined shot with mumps and measles vaccines in what is known as the MMR vaccine, a blockbuster product for the medico-pharmaceutical industry. In case there were any doubts, the MMR vaccine is expected to have a market size of $5.59 billion in 2026 alone. Being considered such a trivial condition, there is a paucity of historical statistics for rubella. However, we do have plenty of statistics regarding measles. In the book Dissolving Illusions, it was noted that the measles death rate was essentially down to zero when the vaccine was introduced to the United States population in 1963. There was a similar picture in England and Wales when the measles vaccine was introduced in 1968. Given that the establishment acknowledges rubella is milder than regular measles, the charts for rubella would be even more of an embarrassment. However, this is where the mainstream narrative plays the extremely dangerous for unborn babies card. So let's take a look at the foundational evidence and establish what exactly they are talking about, particularly with regard to the congenital problems. Wikipedia's Rubella entry states that rubella has symptoms similar to those of flu. However, the primary symptom of rubella virus infection is the appearance of a rash, exanthem, on the face, which spreads to the trunk and limbs and usually fades after 3 days, which is why it is often referred to as 3-day measles. In other words, a typical detoxification process by the body, with skin reactions generally being more common in children. Under congenital rubella syndrome, Wikipedia states that rubella can cause congenital rubella syndrome in the newborn, this being the most severe sequelae of rubella. The syndrome, CRS, follows intrauterine infection by the rubella virus and comprises cardiac, cerebral, ophthalmic, and auditory defects. It may also cause prematurity, low birth weight, neonatal thrombocytopenia, anemia, and hepatitis. Neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism, are common. We are told that rubella was formally recognised as an individual entity in 1881. Furthermore, in 1914, Alfred Fabian Hess theorised that rubella was caused by a virus based on work with monkeys. In 1938, Hiro and Tosaka confirmed this by passing the disease to children using filtered nasal washings from acute cases. Although this 1938 paper is commonly cited as proof of a rubella virus, we were unable to find a copy of it online. The paper's title translates to "Rubella is a viral disease," and it is not found on PubMed. It does appear on Google Scholar, but only as a citation, not the actual paper. However, we have enough information from the internet search results to establish that their methodology was not sufficient to isolate a virus. In summary, Hiro and Tosaka confirmed the viral nature of rubella in 1938 by successfully transmitting the disease to healthy, non-immune children using filtered nasal washings from individuals with acute rubella infections. This experiment provided critical evidence that rubella was caused by a filtrable viral agent, although the specific virus remained unidentified at the time. Such a methodology using filtered samples would not establish an independent variable and thus could not be said to follow the scientific method or be properly controlled. It comes back to the same issue the first time the technique was used for the tobacco mosaic disease in the 1890s. It involves the invention of a hypothesized viral entity rather than the demonstration of one. You can watch my video on tobacco mosaic virus for more details about the flawed interpretations of this technique. In 2024, it was reported by the New York Times that the rubella virus was identified and isolated in the early 1960s by Dr. Paul Parkman and his colleagues at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research in Silver Spring, Maryland. This refers to a 1962 paper titled "Recovery of Rubella Virus from Army Recruits." It appeared in the Proceedings of the Society for Experimental Biology and Medicine alongside another paper, "Propagation and Tissue Culture of Cytopathic Agents from Patients with Rubella-like Illness." And these two papers are said to contain the definitive evidence for the isolation of a rubella virus. However, when they say isolation, the virologists are up to their old tricks again. In the first paper, we read that throat washings were obtained from each patient within 24 to 48 hours of appearance of rash. These were then added to green monkey kidney cells, along with some other ingredients. Subsequent breakdown of the cell culture was deemed to be cytopathic effects and blamed on an imagined virus. In the second paper, blood and urine samples from 4 people with a variety of symptoms were added to human amnion cultures. Again, the declaration of virus was made on the observation of cell breakdown. But they weren't worried if it took 2 months for those appearances to manifest. In other words, if they ended the experiment after a week or 2, they would have concluded there was no virus. It also makes this, quote, virus look rather lazy if it could take at least a month to inflict any significant damage. Anyway, we are informed by the authors that these were, quote, unique cytopathic changes characterized by the aggregation of nuclear material and the presence of inclusion bodies. It is unclear why they would claim aggregation of nuclear material is unique because it is known to occur with various forms of cellular stress, including passaging techniques and temperature changes. Likewise, inclusion bodies are simply protein aggregates which can occur with different forms of cellular stress. Keep in mind that the definition of a virus is a tiny particle consisting of genetic material and a proteinaceous coat. It needs to possess replication competence and is supposed to be a contagious entity that causes disease. In none of these 1962 experiments was such a particle demonstrated. The breakdown of cells in the lab cannot be used as a proxy when the viral particles were not shown to exist in the first place. To add to the smokescreen, both papers mentioned control cultures. This is deceptive because it implies that an independent variable was being manipulated, in this case the alleged virus. However, This was clearly an impossibility, so instead they imagined the virus into existence and decided in advance that their patient samples must contain viruses. This is an issue that even many no-virus adherents have not yet fully appreciated. As my husband Mark outlined in his essay, Virology's Event Horizon, we must consider what would be required to control these cell culture experiments. By the virologist's definition, 2 specimens are used. One that is infected with the virus or vector of interest, the other is treated the same way except without the virus. In order to do this scientifically, it requires a specific physical manipulation of the proposed viral particles between the different specimens. Clearly, they've never done this. By contrast, the technique can be done with bacterial cells because they are found in nature and can be physically manipulated. So the viral cell culture methodology thus collapses on a scientific front because all the virologists do is declare in advance that one of the specimens is, quote, viral and one is, quote, healthy. If this can be known in advance, why would they even bother proceeding to the cell culture? In the case of rubella, they had already declared the virus into existence because in 1938, Hiro and Tosaka had claimed it was a, quote, viral illness. As outlined in Virology's Event Horizon, the results of the virologist cell culture experiments are irrelevant as the technique is trapped within a logical fallacy. There can be no independent variable being tested because the dependent variable, that is, the cytopathic effect, is being conflated with an independent variable that was not shown to exist in the first place. The experimenter can only fallaciously reify the hypothesized entity into existence. So there is no evidence of a rubella virus, and the disease, if it was a specific entity, is admittedly very mild. If this is all we needed to consider, then it would be reasonable to end our investigations there. No virus and a trivial illness, so no need for a vaccine on either account. However, this is where so-called congenital rubella syndrome drives parents into a rubella vaccination frenzy. Congenital rubella syndrome is said to happen when an alleged infection occurs during pregnancy, and the baby can end up having very serious problems, such as deafness, heart disease, eye problems, and intellectual disabilities. The CDC informs us that congenital rubella syndrome was first reported by Norman Gregg, an Australian ophthalmologist, in 1941. At that time, Dr. Gregg published a 12-page report with the title Congenital Cataract Following German Measles in the Mother. He wrote that in the first half of the year, 1941, an unusual number of cases of congenital cataract made their appearance in Sydney. Cases of similar type, which appeared during the same period, have since been reported from widely separated parts of Australia. We should pause here to consider why this problem manifested in the middle of the 20th century. Like the polio epidemics, it is suggestive of a man-made problem involving environmental or pharmaceutical toxicity rather than the virus cover story. You can read Virus Mania and look at our resources on polio for details about that scandal. Coming back to Dr. Gregg's paper, we are informed that the total number of cases included in this review is 78. Over the next pages, he reports on the ophthalmic problems in the babies that he examined. Then it gets to the section titled Etiology or Cause, and he states, by a calculation from the date of the birth of the baby, it was estimated that the early period of pregnancy corresponded with the period of maximum intensity of the very widespread and severe epidemic in 1940 of the so-called German measles. Special attention was accordingly paid to the history of the health of the mothers during pregnancy, and in each new case it was found that the mother had suffered from that disease early in her pregnancy, most frequently in the first or second month. That is an exaggeration, as later in the report he states that in all but 10 cases in this series, the history of German measles infection is present. In case you are wondering, no more evidence is advanced that a specific entity called German measles or rubella caused any of the disease in the babies. Dr. Gregg goes on to acknowledge that It is interesting to note that the rash occurring in this so-called German measles epidemic has been described to me by physicians as macular, morbilliform, scarlatiniform, and toxic erythematous. In other words, it was pleomorphic. He also admitted that it is impossible to obtain any details of the epidemic from the health authorities. In other words, they were lumping together different presentations and rashes and retrospectively declared them all as rubella. When they couldn't attach this label to 10 of the cases, Dr. Gred said he considered it quite likely that the infection had been slight and overlooked. This retrospective and clearly selective and biased data collection is the height of pseudoscience. The methodology could not possibly test a hypothesis, and at most it could have only suggested a future direction of research. While babies were being born with severe problems, blaming a condition with no definitive features and a virus that was never shown to exist simply covered up the real causes. Most mothers will experience mild fevers and various rashes during pregnancy, and yet serious congenital defects in their babies remain rare. Additionally, we know that the wide-ranging features of so-called rubella could be the result of environmental chemicals or pharmaceutical toxicity. Indeed, the history of teratology is riddled with a plethora of compounds that will damage a developing baby. All too often, it is only years later that the industry culprits are widely recognised. You can watch my videos, Safe and Effective, Then and Now, as well as The Myth of Safe and Effective for such examples. Rubella is one of the TORCH, or torch syndrome diseases, that are drilled into the minds of every medical student. The acronym stands for toxoplasmosis, other agents, rubella, cytomegalovirus, and herpes simplex. They are all cover stories that use the imaginary virus model and, in the case of bacteria, the failed germ hypothesis. Ironically, we know that it is, quote, other agents that are responsible for the havoc. But here, of course, they are implying other microbes. Although we may be under attack by fake news, the good news is we are not under attack by nature. A healthy pregnancy relies on a mother who lives by the principles of right thinking and right living. She optimizes her own health through wise daily decisions, and in doing so, the benefits pass on to her growing child. It involves quality organic foods, pure water sources, loving environments, and a sense of purpose. It involves the avoidance of known pollutants and the precautionary principle when it comes to new environmental conditions, such as EMF. A healthy pregnancy certainly does not involve fear campaigns designed to bring customers into the medico-pharmaceutical industry for tests, drugs, and vaccines. Please share this video with anyone who may benefit from this important information. For those who are new to this kind of material, you can use the search function at drsambailey.com to access the free resources we provide covering hundreds of medical and health topics. If you enjoyed this video, please visit supportdrsam.com.